And so what corridors of power really is about drawing a link between all of these and making the case or the argument that the mental health pathologies of Black people, of young Black students in higher learning institutions, is a product of a violence that has not been healed. And it's also a violence that has not been acknowledged. As I said, there has been over time in South Africa a denial of the right of Black people to feel and to express this pain, and an insistence upon us that we must move on and be part of this rainbow nation that is supposedly so beautiful and so extraordinary, that we must be almost thankful that we are no longer being beaten to within an inch of our lives. But what does this in South Africa look like for a young Black person like myself? What does South Africa mean to me as a young Black person who is born into a democratic dispensation? Well, South Africa looks to me like a country that is very deeply steeped in trauma, and a country that continues to hurl young Black people at the margins of existence. We are this month celebrating or commemorating Youth Month, and we are going to see a lot of beautiful things that are being said about the advances and the progress that has been made. But this is going to take place in the context of a South Africa where just a few weeks ago, Statistics South Africa released in every 10 young people are unemployed. It is unprecedented. It has not happened anywhere in the world or anywhere in the history of South Africa really that you had that level of high unemployment. And it is particularly more devastating because it happens during, in a democratic dispensation where the promise of a better life has been cemented in the minds and the hearts of Black people. 7 in every 10 young people is unemployed. And we also know from the very same reports that Statistics South Africa releases periodically, as well as those released by institutions such as the Institute for Security Studies, such as Oxfam Inequality Reports, that the face of unemployment, the face of poverty continues to be Black, right? So of these 7 to 10 young people who are unemployed, even as the report does not give a racial breakdown of this, likely 6.5 of the 7 will be Black people, right? And this is a South African, and will young Black people. So why then, or how then, do we expect to negotiate this space without centering in the issue of mental health pathologies? And the issue of mental health pathologies finds expression in very many ways. You will remember that about a month ago, a story made headlines in South Africa about the killings of 8 young people who were alleged to have been Nyaupe addicts in a place called Zandspruit in Gauteng, Johannesburg. And these young people were accused of having been criminals within the community, of traumatizing and terrorizing the community. And the community woke up one morning at about 2 a.m. in the morning, and they went to round up these 9 young people, and they burned them alive. They were burned alive. Young men were burned alive in South Africa. 4 of them died on the scene, and 4 of the others would later die in hospital. One, I believe, is still fighting for his life in hospital. And even if he was to recover, the extent to which he was beaten and burned means that his life will never be the same. Now, think about it this way. These are young people, some of them the age of 20, 23, 21, the ages are very young, right? These are people who are growing up in a world that has neglected and basically disenfranchise them. They are living in an informal settlement. They are living in abject poverty. They don't have any hope for a better and meaningful life. A life of crime becomes an escape for these young people. Nyaupe becomes a numbing substance to forget, to not remember the debilitating state of their lives and their existence. And of course, communities, when they retaliate because there has not been any protection from them by the police and so on, are not necessarily, and I will not say they're not wrong, but one can understand where they're coming from, because these are their possessions that have been taken from them, that have been robbed and so on. These are their homes that have been broken into. But you must understand that kind of a situation, not simply as a criminality, but as a product and an expression of trauma, right? As Black people who are living together in a very inhabitable space, fighting for very limited resources, and these young people being eliminated from existence, being held into a zone of non-being, fighting then to have a life of some degree of comfort, and they steal and they commit all of these crimes in order that they must sustain habits that numb their pain, but also that they may have food that in their stomachs, right? This is the world into which young Black people are existing, right? But the trauma is not only on those young people, it's not only in that community or in the people who are beating them and burning them alive. It is also in the 7-year-old or the 3-year-old who witnessed that kind of violence, right? It is in that young child who saw a human being being burnt alive. And in my first book, I speak also about the experience of having seen a necklacing happening in my community in Bramfisher, which is an RTP settlement where my family found a home, but that I had also experienced what we call mob justice, right? Happening in Middlelands, also where I grew up, where a man was killed before my eyes, and in Bramfisher, where I saw a man being burnt alive. Those kinds of traumas happen to Black people, because you don't have necklacings happening in Sandton, you don't have necklacing happening in Houghton, and in places or neighborhoods that have historically been those of white people. So the traumas that young people experience in South Africa today, that we are told we must live through because apartheid happened in the past, permeate and continue and impact very severely on our mental health, right? So the mental health challenges of Black people who are now existing in these corridors of death, which are universities, where when young people cannot take it anymore, they die by suicide and so on, is fundamentally what my book is about. And I think what then becomes the following question that comes is, what is it that can be done, right? What is it that needs to be done in South Africa in order that young Black people do not have to existence? Well, a number of things, of course, need to happen. First and foremost, there needs to be, at least from where I sit, an intentional project, right, that must be facilitated by the government of South Africa, by all stakeholders within South Africa, including corporate South Africa and so on, to create spaces and resources within communities, Black communities in townships and in rural areas for healing, right? And this must be in the form of the establishment of important resources and infrastructure that Black people can access when they need to find psychological help. So this will include the deployment of a great number of social workers and psychologists and so on. But that process of healing must also be decolonized in its texture, right? And this means that we need to also utilize other mechanisms of healing, which are specific to Black people and to our way of understanding and of seeing the world. So it must incorporate as well healers, right? Bingaka, Masangoma, it must incorporate spiritualists. There must be various forms, a hybrid and diverse form of healing that comes about into Black communities. It is not rational that when you go to a local clinic to seek help, to find a social worker or a psychologist, you are told that the list is full. You can only come within the next 6 months or within a year. And this happens quite often. In fact, just this morning, I received a message from someone on Facebook saying exactly that to me, that they were looking for help at a local clinic and they were told that the list is full, you will have to come in 2022. It cannot happen that something like that happens in South Africa. And so there needs to be a very deliberate investment into infrastructure for healing for Black people. Secondly, there needs to be an intentional investment into changing and transforming the spaces that create or that deepen this trauma that Black people are enduring. Institutions like Rhodes University simply cannot exist in the form that they do, right? And it is not simply a question of the name, which of course must change. It is fundamentally a question of the institutional cultures that exist in there that marginalize, that alienate Black people, right? And that alienate particularly poor Black people in those spaces. So the cultural institutional cultures within our high learning institutions, but within the labor market as well, must change, because the issues that students are confronting in historically white institutions, issues of racism, issues of exclusion, issues of marginalization, find expression as well in the labor market in South Africa that continues to be highly segmented and that continues to be defined on the lines of race and of sex and of class. So these spaces need to also be transformed. And part of what that transformation must look like is, of course, it needs to be aesthetic, right? So statues of imperialists cannot exist in public spaces. Names of imperialists cannot be given to public institutions like your Rhodes universities and so on. But there must also be a deliberate intention of incorporating the aesthetics that reflect cultural diversity of Black people in those spaces. And it's in the naming of the of monuments, it's in the naming of the streets, it's in the architecture and the aesthetic of the space that must feel for Black students like they're in a place that is not simply accommodating them, but a place into which they belong. And thirdly, and this for me is particularly of great importance, is that South Africa in the form that it exists in is unsustainable. The sheer levels of inequality that exist in the country simply are unsustainable. They reproduce, recreate, and manifest the levels of trauma that I've spoken about that are both economic, political, psychological, and sociological, right? So the economy of South Africa, it is the bedrock on which the country and the society that we live in has been built. And this is something that needs to change, right? Government cannot continue to pay lip service to transforming the segmented labor market into transforming the very economy of South Africa. And it becomes incumbent, particularly on us as young South Africans, as young people in our country, to intentionally engage ourselves in the processes of struggle that are ultimately going to lead to the transformation that we want to see. Every space that exists in South Africa must be seen as a site of struggle. The student activists in universities must continue to fight. We who are now a bit older and are working must continue to fight to see the changes in the labor market that we want to see in South Africa as a whole. But community activists as well in our societies, the struggles that we are waging in our own individual spaces must be brought together to create a kind of a movement at whose center lies the need for, over and above everything, humanizing Black people. And I want to conclude this with a quote by Steve Biko, who argues that the struggle for Black people is fundamentally a struggle about humanizing us. And I might not be saying it in verbatim, but he says that we ought to create a world in which Black people have been humanized, a world into which, above everything else, we create a human face, right? Like the human face, that dignity that we require, the dignity that we deserve. Because to be Black is not a badge of disgrace. To be Black is not a dishonor. It is something that marks us, and it does not mark us out as subservient being. It is our humanity. It is our humanness, and it is a humanness that must be protected. Our mental health must be protected, because ultimately, if we are going to live in a South Africa where Black people's mental health continues to be on the line, it is not a South Africa that we can exist in, because anything that costs us our mental health is simply too expensive. I thank you.
Thank you very much for watching and listening to this very informative session from Malaika. She has shared quite serious matters that needs to be taken into consideration. That the current youth is actually faced with many challenges of psychological struggles, economic struggles, and many other challenges faced with them that include violence. She's shared the story of Naledi, who had committed suicide due to her experiences, and the fact that nobody knows what happened to Naledi, as she only gave on Twitter her date of birth and her date of death. What kind of a society have we become where the youth we are bringing up is quite oppressed and suppressed in many situations? She's saying these challenges are not from today, they are coming way back from historical challenges, as we all know what was happening in our fathers and our great grandfathers, whom had to go and leave their families and in search of livelihood. The women that had to endure all the bringing up of these kids. She brings up that landlessness was one of the challenges that we were faced with, not only for agricultural purposes, but also for a sense of dignity in urban areas. A black child is still faced with the challenge of no libraries in our communities. A black child is faced with a challenge of a realistic situation where Nyaope is the name of the game. Thank you, Malaika, for sharing all the information that you've shared with us. She's a much acclaimed author. As you have heard, she discusses her books. And we wish that we can engage more as she speaks about the violent nature our society is living in and what should be done to take that out and bring normality. Thank you very much and all the best for your future endeavors. Amaqhawe ethu are very pleased with your lecture, and we hope that it has reached our homes in the Mpuma Kapa area. I thank you very much to the viewers, and thank you to everybody that has contributed to the success of this show. Our producers behind the scenes and organizers of these lectures. They are appreciated. Please remember to put on your masks, to sanitize, and to keep the social distance. As we are sailing in the third wave, may we be protected. Thank you very much.